we go. All right, so I would encourage everybody to find a comfortable seat that will allow you to really get settled in your body. You might find that it's best to have your feet on the floor and your back straight. You could close your eyes or find a soft focus, whatever is going to help you be most present in this moment. And I would invite you to turn your attention to your breathing. You don't have to change your breathing. You don't have to lengthen your inhales and exhales or shorten them. You can simply allow your breath to be what it is. Inhaling and exhaling. Flowing with this function that for most of us is a natural, instinctual breathing in and breathing out, this inhale and exhale that supports us without our having to do a lot of work, most of us. Breathing in and breathing out. And now I would invite you to turn your attention to your body, to notice the feel of your body in the chair or the bed or the sofa or wherever you find yourself. Notice what your body feels like in this moment. Notice if there's any sensation, any fatigue or tension or pain or jitters or excitement or whatever the sensation in your body might be. And again, you don't have to change it. It's enough simply to notice it. And see if you have noticed any tension or sensation or emotion in your body. Notice if you're able simply to release that sensation. Maybe it doesn't go away. Maybe you can simply accept that it's there. And if you can't, that's okay too. There's no judgment needed. You're just noticing what your body feels like in this moment, in this space, in this point in the eternal now. And see now if you can turn your attention to your spiritual body. Notice if there's anything in your spiritual, emotional, psychological life that is splitting your attention away from being right here and right now. Some exciting news you received or some anxiety about something to come, some curiosity, whatever it might be. Notice if there's anything that's distracting you from full and total presence. And again, see if you can release whatever that might be. And if you can't, that's all right too. Breathing in and breathing out. I have a poem about springtime to get us started as a kind of concluding prayer to our meditation. Some of you may have heard me read this before. And notice how this poem lands in your body and your spirit on this particular day. Call it sloth, call it sleaze, call it bummery if you please. I'll call it patience. I'll call it joy, this my supine congress with the newly yawning grass and beetles chittering in their offices beneath me. As I, nearly drifting to dream, admire this so-called weed, which, if I guarded with teeth bared my garden of all alien breeds, if I was all knife and axe and made a life of hacking, would not have burst gorgeous forth and beckoning, these sort of phallic spires ringleted by these sort of vaginal blooms, which the new bees, being bees, heed. And yes, it's spring, if you can't tell from the word my mind makes of the world. And everything makes me mildly or more hungry. The worm turning in the leaf mold, the pear blooms howling forth their pungence. Even, let me get the mute again here. Even the neighbor cats shimmy through the grin in the fence. And the way this bee before me, after whispering in my ear, dips her head into those dainty lips, not exactly like one entering a chapel. And friends, as if that wasn't enough, blooms forth with her forehead dusted pink, like she has been licked and so blessed by the kind of God to whom this poem is prayer. So this poem that I read is called Patience by Ross Gay, and it's from an amazing collection of poetry he has called A Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. I highly recommend him to you. And I should have said at the beginning, I will be putting together a list of quotations and poetry that I'm using in the talks, and I'll make that available to you. It just hasn't gotten fully put together yet. I tend to pick my quotations on the fly a lot of times, and I don't want to miss something that you might want to have later on. So I chose this poem to start because it's all about, well, it's about a lot of things, but it's all about, in one sense, being open to discovering relationship with the beauty and the joy that are all around us. He admires this so-called weed, which if I guarded with teeth bared, my garden of all alien breeds would not have burst gorgeous forth and beckoning. This beautiful weed that flowers for him and brings him into the joy of spring. And I'm aware as I read this poem and as we enter our conversation about contemplative ecology that what we call things really matters. The words we use for the world around us shape our experience of the world. They shape our understanding of the natural world, of creation, of God. I think we have, feminists really to thank for opening up our understanding of how much the language we use about God shapes the way we know and understand God. And detractors from broadening our language about God and theology will point to this being sort of a new age or a modern obsession with political correctness. But it's actually very old, and I've been reading a little bit of Julian of Norwich recently and loving all of the stuff she has about Christ our Mother, and that's 14th century right there. So whenever we're a little offended or shocked by something people in sort of contemporary Christian circles might say, we just have to go back a thousand years and we'll find people were saying all these outrageous things about God, 1,000 years ago too. We're really, we can be very tame in our understanding. But so what we call things really matters, and the words we use shape our understanding. And that's some of what we're going to get into today about, I'm going to be relying heavily on Robin Wall Kimmerer and an essay she's written called Learning the Grammar of Animacy. And that's from a book called Braiding Sweetgrass right here. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. Again, this will be in the bibliography that I give you. The subtitle is Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And Kimmerer is a botanist and also Native American, immersed in Native American spirituality. And she brings the two together beautifully in this collection of essays. So we're going to talk about the grammar of animacy. But before we get there, let's do a few other definitions and more talk of words here. So this is a retreat on contemplative ecology. And you may be wondering, as I do all the time, what is contemplative ecology? What is contemplation and what is ecology, and how do they sort of fit together? So I think the ecology piece is a little easier to define. One simple definition of ecology, the one that I work with, is that ecology really is a study of the web of relationships that ties together the planetary community. That's a broad definition, and I'll repeat that. Ecology is the study of the web of relationships that ties together the planetary community. So ecology is all about relationship. It's about my relationship to the natural world, and it's about my relationship to all of the people in the natural world. And notice I didn't just say the human people, but all the people that are in this world that we get to partake in. Well, contemplation is also about relationship. There are many definitions of contemplation, and many of those are very good. The working definition that I use for contemplation is that contemplation is a long, loving look at the real, capital R, real. So again, I'll repeat that. Contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. So what does that definition make available to us? Well, first of all, contemplation is long. Contemplation is not a state that we achieve at some point. It is a way of being in the world that takes a lifetime to develop and to enter into. It is something that is, because it's long, it's slow, actually. Contemplation is about slowing down and about entering into the long moment, the moment where a sense of time drops away. Um, Contemplation is about loving. So the look is not just long, but it's a loving look. Now, loving doesn't mean that it is, it's not Pollyanna-ish. Loving doesn't mean that there is no discord or tension or sadness or suffering or anything like that. It doesn't mean that we overlook all of the difficult things in our own lives or in the world around us. So love, in the sense I'm talking about, has to go deeper than an emotional or a psychological experience. Love is in the sense that Paul Tillich talks about God as the ground of our being. You know, love is the foundation underneath everything that exists, and it's also the second by second interaction with God that keeps existence in existence. It's not the flowery feeling of Hallmark cards, though it includes that too. So contemplation is long, it's loving, and it's a look. Contemplation, here's part of where the relationship aspect of contemplation comes in. Contemplation is about staring into the face of the beloved. Contemplation is sitting here before our retreat starts and seeing all these beautiful faces flow by on my iPad screen. Contemplation is about gazing, it's about seeing. And gradually over time, seeing through the eyes of love and seeing things as they really are. And that gets to the last piece of my definition, which, by the way, is not my definition, but a definition that I picked up from Don Bisson, who was my spiritual director for a time, and many of you may be familiar with him and his work on Jung and Christianity. And so the look is long and loving, but it's also a look at the real. So contemplation is about engaging reality, capital R reality. And I'm not assuming that I know what reality is. That is a part of what happens in contemplation, is that we come face to face oftentimes with reality. Our understanding of reality changes. And that is reality or the truth about the world, about ourselves, about one another. And again, those may not always be pleasant sort of things to come in face to face with. But the real, I'm convinced the deepest reality is actually the face of God, which is love itself, shining out to us. So even when we come face to face with some aspect of ourselves, of ourselves or another that's really unpleasant, if we can move through that experience, we'll often get to an even deeper sense of reality, and we'll be in communion with the love that undergirds even that. So contemplative ecology, then, if we put these two together, contemplative ecology is a practice or a way of being in which we come closer to seeing the face of God in the entire planetary community, and in staring into the face of God in a long, loving way with the entire planetary community, which includes ourselves and all the creatures on this planet, and really the whole cosmos, the whole created reality. One of the real heroes for me and sort of founding mothers and fathers of contemplative ecology is Thomas Berry. And some of you may be familiar with Thomas Berry. a wonderful place to start, if you're not, is The Dream of the Earth. This is a collection of his writings from various times and periods, and it gives you a real sense of his thought on ecology. He wrote a lot about ecology from a contemplative Christian point of view. But really what I take from him about as a foundation for where I come from on contemplative ecology is he says there are essentially three fundamental truths about the created world. The first is differentiation. These are his sort of three pillars. One is differentiation. So by differentiation, he means that absolutely every being is radically unique. There is no person or being in existence that is exactly the same as any other person or being. There is no human being in the past or in the future or in the present that is exactly the same as you. Every being is radically unique. The second point that he makes, the second pillar, is subjectivity. He says that each of these radically unique beings is its own subject, has its own subjectivity, which is to say has its own window onto reality, its own unique piece of reality that it holds. I would say each unique being conveys something of God that no other being can convey. He often, in another place, he uses the word interiority instead of subjectivity in some of his writing to convey the same point. So, the great oak tree in our cloister here in the monastery is both radically unique. There's no other tree that's exactly like it, nor will there be, nor has there been. And that tree also has its own kind of interiority. Now, I can't understand or know what that interiority is, but I do believe that it has that. And the third pillar of his understanding of ecology is what he calls communion. And so he says that even though every being is radically unique, we are all connected to one another. We all, in the Christian tradition, we would say we all indwell one another. As Jesus says in the Gospel of John about God, I am in you and you are in me. And he uses that phrasing over and over again to refer to his relationship with God and to his relationship with his disciples and with all of us. That there's a mutual indwelling between Jesus and God and between Jesus and us. And so Barry picks up on this and he says, this is true of the whole creation. There's a piece that I don't have access to in my conscious life. There's a piece of that oak tree that dwells in me, and I dwell in that oak tree. And again, this is a deeper spiritual reality that I don't have access to in my conscious way of being most of the time. But many of us, maybe most of us, have these moments of unveiling. Thomas Merton's Fourth and Walnut experience in Louisville that he talks about, where for just the briefest moment, we're able to see that actually everything is radiating God just all the time. And I think those experiences are much more common than we want to believe. So the idea is that each being is a universe unto itself. And I think, we have to say that we're all a mystery. This is another piece that I take from Barry's 3 pillars. There's a part of each of us that remains inaccessible, even to us. A part of us that's so deep that we will never know it. We will never fully exhaust our understanding of who we are. That's that piece of interiority that is already in communion with every other being. Again, returning to Merton, he says in Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, something to the effect of, that piece remains inaccessible to our own fantasies. We can't exploit that piece of ourselves. That's that piece that belongs only to God. So this is where I would normally pause and ask for your questions, because this is a good pausing place. But that's not really feasible in this context. So make a note if you have a question, and we'll have a little question and answer time at the end of the talk. I want to turn now to, with this as these 3 pillars as our kind of structure, to look at Robin Wall Kimmerer and her thinking in her essay, Learning the Grammar of Animacy. So as I mentioned, Kimmerer is both a scientist and a spiritual person. She comes from the Native American tradition, the Anishinaabe people, if I'm remembering correctly. And she brings together spiritual understanding from her background with scientific exploration of botany. And what she comes up with is really just extraordinary. And reading this essay, again, I come back to the understanding that what we call things really matters. So when I've done this retreat in person, I've given the retreatants a copy of this essay, and we've discussed it. I can't give you a copy of the essay because with this many people, that would really be a copyright infringement. But I would encourage you to buy the book or check it out from your library, and at the very least, read this essay. But I'm going to read you some selections from it to inform our discussion. The context she's giving here is that she was not raised speaking the language of her Anishinaabe people, and she decides as an adult she wants to learn that language. So she starts to learn the language, and she finds that the way that the language conveys speaks of natural things in the natural world is very different from English. So for instance, she uses the example of a bay, and she says in Potawatomi, you don't say that it is a bay. Bay is not a noun. Bay is actually a verb. To be a bay is the way that the grammar of the language conveys the sense of being a bay, that the bay is a being. So this is what she has to say about this. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb to be a bay releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall. And there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday. All are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. Water, land, and even a day. The language, a mirror for seeing the animacy of the world. The life that pulses through all things, through pines and nuthatches and mushrooms. This is the language I hear in the woods. This is the language that lets us speak what wells up all around us. And the vestiges of boarding schools, the soap-wielding missionary wraiths, hang their heads in defeat. This is the grammar of animacy. Imagine seeing your grandmother standing at the stove in her apron and then saying of her, "Look, it is making soup. It has gray hair." We might snicker at such a mistake, but we also recoil from it. In English, we never refer to a member of our family, or indeed to any person as it. That would be a profound act of disrespect. It robs a person of selfhood and kinship, reducing a person to a mere thing. So it is in Potawatomi and most other indigenous languages, we use the same words to address the living world as we use for our family, because they are our family. Reading that just sort of delights me and opens up a totally new way of seeing the world around me. And I remember when I read this, staring out at the Hudson River that flows past our monastery day in and day out, and realizing, oh my God, the river is alive. And it seemed so obvious once I had read this, that of course the river is alive. And, you know, I knew the trees were alive. I knew the animals were alive. But to see that, you know, a body of water is also alive. And where, you know, how do we choose to limit our understanding of where life exists? And why do we feel the need to limit our understanding of where life exists? And I'm convinced that this is, this way of seeing is really, it's something we all know deep down. It's something that we have to remember, most of us. I think it's something we once knew individually and communally. It is, and this is why I called this talk our common heritage. This way of knowing is older than most institutional religion. And even where our religious traditions have often run roughshod over this way of knowing, they haven't been able to exterminate it, and it is still present within our religious traditions as well. So more on that in a little bit, but I want to read you some more of the grammar of animacy. So she's sharing this information with a class that she's teaching a little bit later in the essay. And she says of one of her students, he said it felt like an awakening to him, more like a remembering, I think. The animacy of the world is something we already know, but the language of animacy teeters on extinction, not just for native peoples, but for everyone. Our toddlers speak of plants and animals as if they were people, extending to them self and intention and compassion until we teach them not to. We quickly retrain them and make them forget. When we tell them that the tree is not a who, but an it, we make that maple an object. We put a barrier between us, absolving ourselves of moral responsibility and opening the door to exploitation. Saying it makes a living land into natural resources. If a maple is an it, we can take up the chainsaw. If a maple is a her, we think twice. The arrogance of English is that the only way to be animate, to be worthy of respect and moral concern, is to be human. A language teacher I know explained that grammar is just the way we chart relationships in language. Maybe it also reflects our relationships with each other. Maybe a grammar of animacy could lead us to whole new ways of living in the world. Other species, a sovereign people. A world with a democracy of species, not a tyranny of one. With moral responsibility to water and wolves, and with a legal system that recognizes the standing of other species. It's all in the pronouns. So again, what we call things really matters. It really shapes how we see them, how we understand them. And I think, imagine this arrogance that we human beings should be the only creatures on the planet worthy of protection and responsibility and relationship, of caring and of love. I think we have to learn a different way of seeing and of speaking and of relating, because the way of seeing that sees human beings as the only creatures worthy of protection and respect, the only ones demanding responsibility, is the same attitude that leads us to exploit the world around us, to cut down rainforests and to pollute waters, and to see the world that we live in as a resource to be extracted and capitalized on, as money to be made, rather than to recognize that we're held in a web of relationships that require tending and that make demands on us, that limit our freedom to act as we might want to act, in the same way that our family relationships make demands on us, that we choose. I often use the image of a vow. You know, when you're in a vowed relationship, whether it's a marriage or a monastic relationship or a priestly vow or whatever kind of vow it may be, that our vows bind us. They make demands on us. They limit us. But in that limitation, they allow us to move more deeply into the lives that God has invited us into. So it is if we allow the natural world to invite us into relationship, to make demands on us. We have the responsibility to respond, but we also are given the gift of relationship and deeper relationships than we have otherwise with the world around us. And I think that we would be, I think the world is such a lonely place if human beings are the only ones that we can interact with and love and care for and seek mutuality with. When there are hundreds and thousands and millions of other beings out there outside of the human family that we could also love and be loved by. So many faces of God that we limit ourselves from seeing and interacting with. So what's called for then is I'm realizing we're at quarter till, so I'm going to move a little more quickly here. I think that as Westerners and Christians, we need to unlearn many of the ways that we have been taught to interact with both our religious tradition and with the natural world. You may have heard the phrase creation ex nihilo, that is often used as a tenet in Christian theology. And the idea that God created the world out of nothing, that there was nothing at all, and then God created the world. But following on Cynthia Bourgeault and some of her writing in the book Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening, I've become convinced that actually that's total nonsense, that God never created from nothing. God created from God's very being. Cynthia draws on Karl Rahner, who talks about at creation, calls God the prodigal who squanders himself. There's the sense that at the creation, God pours God's own substance out, and from God's own substance creates everything that is. And when we look at creation that way, the lines that are often raised about, that the human being was created to subdue the earth and to rule the earth, we have to see that in a very different light. If the earth is made up of God, if God poured God's self out to make creation, then we actually should be stewards of creation. We should be helping creation to live into the fullness of what it is meant to be, rather than subduing it and ruling it and exploiting it and capitalizing on it. And there are these beautiful lines with that understanding of the prodigal who squanders himself. When you read the very beginning of Genesis, in the beginning, before God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. When I read that now, what I hear is, in the beginning, there was only God. There was God dwelling with God. Formless and void doesn't mean that God was alone, but God was there only with God's self. And the truth, if we see from the contemplative ecological point of view, is there's still only God. When we look around, there's still only God. It's just God in multiplicity, in this multiplicity of forms and faces. And I'm seeing many of those forms and faces on my screen right in front of me. Cynthia Bourgeault in Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening puts it this way. I'll read you the whole quotation. And again, this will be in your bibliography. Self-emptying, which is another way of describing God's action and pouring God's self out at creation. Self-emptying is, in the deepest sense, self-disclosure, which is fundamentally a creative act. So there's this sense that when God pours God's self out into this multiplicity of forms, God's actually disclosing God's self, is allowing us to know God in ways that we couldn't when God was just formless darkness itself. This self-disclosure tends to bring new worlds into existence by revealing what had formerly been present only in potential. Many of the most subtle Christian theologians believe this is how God originally created the world, through a radical self-outpouring. The prodigal who squanders himself, as Karl Rahner puts it. It is also clearly how Christ redeemed it, storing up nothing, clinging to nothing, equally at home in humiliation and glory. His ultimate act of self-emptying upon the cross is what brings into being the new creation. So Bourgeois conveys this incredible sense that really this is the movement of God kind of beneath the surface of what we're able to see, is like the river that's constantly moving. God is constantly pouring God's self out, both in creation and in redemption. And that creation and redemption are seen through that lens of outpouring the same action. We sing in our gospel canticle here at the monastery during Eastertide, all creation rejoices and sings, for Christ is risen from the grave. That at the resurrection, the whole creation rejoices. And I love in some of those gospel accounts of the resurrection, when the stone is rolled away, you get this sense in some of them that actually the tomb itself was the first witness to the resurrection. The rock was the first witness to the resurrection. The cave was the first one. The cave may be the only one that actually saw the resurrection happen in that sense, in the moment. And so God is constantly pouring God's self out, both to create and to redeem. And every living being is an expression of that movement of God's love within and around all of us. So these reflections, partial though they are, bring me really to the question, and this returns to Wall Kimmerer in her essay, what happens if we take ourselves out of the center of the story? If humanity is not the center of the religious story, the gospel story, the creation story, if it's not all about us, if we're not the shining pinnacle of the evolutionary tree, I take a metaphor from 12-step spirituality in this. I think we have the opportunity to become what in 12-step spirituality is called being a worker among workers, or a person among persons. We don't have to be special to be worthwhile. We don't have to be totally, we are radically unique in the Thomas Berry sense, but it doesn't have to be all about us for us to be in relationship. That actually, when you raise the valleys and lower the mountains, there's sort of a level plane that we can exist in relationship with all the other creatures on the planet and with one another. The theological word we use for this is humility. To be grounded, to be plugged into the humus, the earth, which is also to say, in the monastic tradition, we talk about standing in the light of the truth, in that sense. Wall Kimmerer says that in many Native American traditions, humanity is seen as the younger sisters and brothers of creation. That we were the last, and this is comes along in the Genesis account too, we were the last of the beings created. Perhaps we should listen to our older sisters and brothers. We might have something to learn from them. As one example, I think about the trees. And the more that scientists study trees, and if you're interested in hearing more about this, there's a great book called The Secret Life of Trees, or The Hidden Life of Trees, that's what it's called. But the more we learn about trees, the more we realize that a forest is itself a kind of superorganism, and that trees actually share resources with one another. They raise young, they communicate with one another about danger and predators. And it doesn't look anything like the way that human beings do that, but they still do that. And I wonder if we paid more attention to the tree people, to the ones who are being trees, could we learn how to be in community in a different way, a way that is more connected, where we care for one another's young and share our own resources more fully? What lessons could we learn about how to be? And there is finally, as we're talking about language, the difference between being a colonist and being a native. And again, this comes from Kimmerer, but she talks about the native is a person who looks around at the world around them and says, this is my home. This is the place that provides for me. This is the place that I'm going to be in for the rest of my life. And then feels a responsibility to take care of that place. Whereas the colonist is the person who looks around and says, oh, my home is elsewhere, and so I can take whatever I want from the place that I am now, because I'm going to send it back to my real home. I think one of the gifts, perhaps, of this time of pandemic is that we are plugged into our homes in a way that many of us are not used to. And we are being confronted with the reality that this earth is the only home we have. There isn't another one. And if we don't take care of the one we have, there won't be a home for us or for many other creatures. And so as we learn the grammar of animacy, I think we also learn what it means to be native. And we allow ourselves to move into the native way of being. And I don't mean Native American, as in the First Nations here, though I think that many Native American cultures show us a way to be in the land that we're in. But to realize that the places we are, this is our home. And we can't keep extracting and extracting and extracting, because there won't be anything left to extract at a certain point. But at the end, I return to the sense that by learning the grammar of animacy, the world becomes a less lonely place. That we have a wealth of relationships that open up to us when the trees are people too, when the river is a person too, when the groundhogs have their own sense of autonomy and being. Now, I'm not going to get the groundhog to curl up in my lap, right? But I can form a relationship by watching them. This is contemplation. By watching them, by learning their habits, I come to recognize them. And I see our groundhogs here every spring when they have their babies and they're running around and they're chewing the grass and all of that sort of thing. I feel as if I know them on some level. And there's a way of being that is made available to me. My world becomes larger. There's more space for love there. And that's really, I mean, that's really the purpose of any contemplative practice, of any practice of prayer, is to have our sense of God and our sense of ourselves and our access to love made larger. So that's where I'm going to end the talk today. Tomorrow, we'll meet again at 2 o'clock for those who are interested. And the talk tomorrow is called From Betrayal to Hope. So tomorrow, we're going to look in more detail at some of the darkness that surrounds us, that makes it difficult to hope, particularly in an ecological frame. And what might hope look like as we are surrounded by plague and pandemic and environmental devastation? What does hope look like in that? So that's where we'll go tomorrow. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and if you have questions or reflections you'd like to add, please, there is a raise hand button, and please raise your hand and I will unmute you individually so we don't have, you know, a bunch of people all speaking at once. So let me just